Well, we have some wonderful news to share, breaking news to kick off this half hour. Meme maker Douglas Mackey has prevailed in his recent appeal. The Circuit Court of Appeals threw out his conviction for quote unquote election interference over a meme. Now, as you'll recall, because Mackey's been on this show, The Absolute Truth, before, Mackey was targeted by Joe Biden's DOJ, threatened with prison. He was smeared all over the corporate media for a 2016 joke. It was just a joke, a meme, making fun of Hillary Clinton's campaign. He'll join us after around 2:40, so in about 10 minutes after we talk with Allison Steinberg. In other breaking news, President Donald Trump indulged reporters with an extended Q&A while lunching with leaders of African nations at the White House in the last hour, where he touted his administration's actions against USAID.
And trade seems to be a foundation that I've been able to settle a lot of these disputes, like as an example, India and Pakistan, Kosovo, Serbia. I said, you guys are going to fight, we're not going to trade. And we seem to be quite successful in doing that. To that end, we have closed the USAID group to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, which was tremendous waste, fraud, and abuse. And we're working tirelessly to forge new economic opportunities involving both the United States and many African nations. There's great economic potential in Africa, like few other places in many ways. In the long run, this will be far more effective and sustainable and beneficial than anything else that we can be doing together.
The president referencing how detrimental USAID has been to U.S. interests across the globe, creating tensions with countries across the world that we could actually be working with. Of course, that being probably a big topic today as the president talks with these African leaders and looks to implement an African strategy he would have implemented in the second immediately consecutive term had the 2020 election not been stolen. These comments from the president also come as we continue to learn more, honestly, by the day, as to the nefarious initiatives funded by USAID with our tax dollars. And for more on that, we go now to Allison Steinberg live on Capitol Hill for us. Allison, it's not surprising per se that USAID and the Wuhan lab are now making news synonymously in the same story again, right?
Yeah, not too surprising at all. In fact, as it turns out, we're now finding that USAID sent 11,000 viral samples to the Wuhan Institute of Virology over the course of this 10-year program. The program was dubbed PREDICT, interesting name, PREDICT, and it was $210 million in funding from USAID. So ultimately, this implemented a long-term storage plan that sent the viruses overseas to various countries, but namely, these viruses were sent to Yunnan, I believe it's called. This is ultimately the main province in Wuhan, where obviously the scamdemic allegedly originated from. So this is major news. I mean, we have suspected for a long time that this wasn't just, a China virus. I know it's been dubbed that, but there's also reports of this actually being initiated here. And I think this is further proof. This really cements the fact that the U.S. government under the Biden regime was heavily involved with the funding of the COVID scamdemic and, ultimately then allowing this to spread throughout the globe. So, yeah, I think it's very interesting. And I would like to say I hope that everyone involved is held accountable. But given what just happened with the Epstein case, I'm not so hopeful that's going to happen. But, it's good that the real story is coming out here.
And so just to clarify on this, the new information that we've learned here, we've talked about the PREDICT program in the past. It was a government initiative that was supposed to be aimed at preventing pandemics and also quickly creating vaccines, as I recall, because we talked about it a lot in 2021, particularly creating vaccines to address said pandemics that obviously they were involved in creating. I don't think we realized that how involved USAID was in sending, 11,000 virus samples to this Wuhan lab and a hostile nation towards the United States. That is extremely concerning. Is that the new information that we're learning? How much money and how USAID's involvement was? What USAID's involvement was with the transfer of these viruses?
Yeah, I mean, they're in direct correspondence and correlation with Wuhan, China, which obviously China is probably our greatest adversary. So the fact that we are working directly hand in hand with China, Wuhan, in the case of this, these viruses and the scamdemic that many of us still haven't forgotten about, it is extremely alarming. And then, of course, you have Dr. Fauci, who says there's none of this ever happened. He'll just deny it till the end of time. When we now have the proof and evidence that this was indeed a real thing, the U.S. was directly involved. There was also a piece of this article that said, and I'm quoting, investigations involving USAID's former funding of global health awards remains active and ongoing. A senior State Department official told the outlet, the American people can now rest assured that under Trump, we will not be funding these controversial programs. But of course, these were all funded, and happily so, under the previous regime and others before. So this is extremely concerning. I'm so grateful that Trump shut this down and DOJ uncovered all the corruption within USAID so early on. In fact, if you remember, we were there covering it the day that USAID got shut down. So that was a great day. And I think it's so important that, this has happened so we can stop the corruption on a mass scale.
Yeah, this was definitely a key component to reining in the corruption. There's so much more work to be done. And I'm glad that the president did mention it today. Obviously, there was this exclusive story from the Daily Caller, but also I think that we can't forget what USAID funding was used to do, especially as we look to course correct on some of our foreign policy across the globe, because what we did learn through the funding of USAID and where the money was flowing is that it actively worked against the U.S. interests in many countries. And I have heard from, Allison, I have literally heard from so many government officials across the globe from, these smaller countries. They really praised Donald Trump, and we're so thankful that we were addressing, his administration was addressing the USAID corruption, because they felt like this money had been used to destabilize their countries, and it really put tensions between them and the United States. So that's great news, Allison. And I think that, obviously that was something, Trump mentioned it because in bringing these African nations to the table, he realized that had been a deterrent in the past. Now, in talking about the Wuhan lab, there still has not been accountability. And remember, that is that lab that had a partnership with Echo Health Alliance, the group that was involved in the gain of function research with the WIV, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They also received USAID funding, but they were receiving funding from every entity in the government. There hasn't been accountability, and that is something that we continue to look to RFK too, and we are hoping that they'll rein in some of the jab policies. We talked about that a little bit earlier today in my show, Allison, but there is more news on the RFK front, which we talked about with Karen Kingston as well, and that its medical groups are suing RFK Jr., correct? Policies. We talked about that a little bit earlier today in my show.
And interfering with the vaccine advisory panel, which we know he recently axed the previous members that were in a lawsuit with them. But I think he is